Okay, usually this is where I would start the list with just like a funny little quip or a funny little skit. And honestly, I kind of first wanted to make a little bit of notes before we get started with the video. You might notice that my voice is a little bit off compared to usual and such. That's because I just got done with, as of this recording, I got done with a big, like, over 10-hour Extra Life charity stream where I talked a lot throughout the stream and then doing a full set review of Crimson Vow, which you can watch on my Twitch channel if you want. It is kind of like breaked into parts due to unfortunate internet connection. But if you notice that my voice is a little bit off compared to my usual fun shenanigans, I apologize. My voice is still kind of recovering from that. And if you notice that some of the entries in this is going to be a little bit shorter, it's mostly because if I think it's just a card that's just a good card in general, that doesn't need much elaboration, I'm going to keep it short and simple for the sake of my voice. So, just what I would let you guys know on that. And now, on to the video.
Number 10.
Number 10 on my list is Genre, Dressed to Kill. A free mana planeswalker that has free loyalty and has +1, add red. Genre Dressed to Kill deals 1 damage up to 1 target player or planeswalker. It also has +1 again to exile the top card of your library. If it's red, you may cast it this turn. And it also has a -7 where you exile the top 5 cards of your library. You may cast red spells for Monum this turn. But it also importantly has an emblem where if you get this emblem, it has whenever you cast a red spell, this emblem deals X damage to any target, where X is the amount of mana spent to cast that spell. Very good card in my personal opinion. I kind of like Genre a lot for potentially mono red aggro based decks. I think this is a very powerful card. It's not like a Torch of Defiance, I would definitely say that without a sweat. Torch of Defiance is definitely kind of the better card in a sense, but I do think one does have its chops in the meta, especially if you're playing mono red aggro or even mono red mid range. I could even see this seeing some play in Izzet or Rakdos based aggro decks that have a high priority within red within their mana pool. Mostly because just the +1s, the multiple pluses are relevant. The +1, just the ramp, like you could turn free this and then turn 4 Goldspan Dragon. That's very powerful. You cannot deny that assessment, especially when you have the mana to essentially be able to do the ramp, but also being able to just incrementally deal 1 damage to your opponent, or to a problematic planeswalker. The dealing of 1 damage to potentially to a planeswalker is going to be very relevant in this meta, since we have like the Loaths of the world, or the planeswalkers that usually when they activate their first ability, they're going to have 1 toughness. So Genre can easily kill those planeswalkers without much of a sweat, so I think that's going to be a lot more relevant than people take at first glance. Then also being able to, once you're kind of like getting empty-handed, having the other +1 to exile the top card of your library. If it's red, you may play it this turn. This could be very relevant for multiple things. Maybe you use it to essentially be able to cast a free spell, but you could also use this in a semi-sense of, like, maybe you saw that there's a land on top through other means with cards that we have in the meta, and you can just exile that card so you can draw into better cards and such. Like, there's little ways you can actually brew around that. The second one plus is not the most exciting thing in the world, but in a mono red deck, it's card advantage, and card advantage is always nice on a planeswalker. We're going to probably get to that later with one of our later entries, but we'll get to that on shortly. And of course, if you can get to the ultimate is pretty much a you win the game, essentially. Because being able to draw 5 cards, being able to cast those 5 cards, very powerful. But even then, that emblem is nothing to underestimate, because you can just do a significant amount of burn damage with that. Like, for example, let's say you are playing this in mono red, and you have, of course, to be on flavor, have Light of the Night. If you did get to the ultimate on this, and you have Light of the Night on hand, you could literally just be like, okay, I'm gonna do Light of the Night for, like, let's say 5... and then deal 5 damage to the opponent, but then due to the casting cost of the spell being technically 6, then you deal an additional 6 points of damage. Like, that ultimate, if you can incorporate X red spells within your deck design, can be relatively silly, relatively quick. Plus, there's enough powerful ones that are even in, like, red-black and red-blue that we have. Like, red-black, I could think of, like, Asmodeus as an example I could think of right off the bat. No, not Asmodeus. What is it? It's the demon that it can act like a board wipe and can also essentially be a reanimated spell for multiple creatures. It's not Asmodeus. Asmodeus is the Devil King. Editor, you can probably I'll probably... Orcus, that's the name of it. It's Orcus. Wow, that was a brain fart if I ever had one. But still, there's stuff like that. You can definitely look at the X spells and such, so... There's definitely some versatility with this card, plus just both this art as well as the wedding art of this. Absolutely gorgeous. So yeah, Shauna Dressed to Kill. Mana Curves is going to like this card, obviously, but I can think that there's going to be some mono red aggro at least giving this card a shot without a sweat. And hey, I always have a heart for free mana genres, because they usually are fun little brew round cards in my personal opinion. So, number 10, Shauna Dressed to Kill. Number 9 on the list, and this one was kind of I fell in love with it the minute I saw the card, so let's talk about it. Grolnok the Omnivore. A 4-mana free, which the stats is kind of hill giantly, and it's a frog, so yay, frogs. But it's also a very fun frog, because whenever a frog you control attacks, mill free cards. And then whenever a permanent card is put into your graveyard from your library, exile it with a croak counter on it. Okay, the flavor on that is absolutely hilarious. And then you may play lands and cast spells from one card you own and exile with croak counters on them. So there's definitely a lot of ways you can brew around this card, both in Standard and EDH. It's also very cute that you can actually play this in the same deck with Croaking Counterpart, and then just make frog copies, attack with the frog copies to essentially then self-mill yourself to play more permanents, essentially, thanks to Grolnok's ability. The fact that it's also the croak counters, the cards are exiled with croak counters, so even if Grolnok gets initially croaked, the fact that you can actually either cast a second copy or recast it if you're playing this in Commander, as your commander, then you still have access to the cards with the croak counters. That's a very powerful, you get yourself kind of like a frog-based hand. There's probably a better way to actually make that pun, but you kind of get my point there. Being able to have an access to a semi-second hand is very nice. And also it is just very nice in general that this also works by any mill effect in general. So it doesn't have to be Grolnok or any frogs attacking itself. If you play cards like Mulch within your deck design, if you play any like self-mill cards in general, you can get the cards with croak counters on them very nifty, and it's kind of works as kind of like a secondary hand as long as Grolnok's on the battlefield. That could be very nifty in like Simic mid-range value decks, but also could even be nifty in like maybe combo-based value decks. So, Grolnok, very lovely card. There's definitely some jank to brew around them, and there's even some potential good EDH, even CEDH shenanigans you can do with Grolnok. So, yeah, number 9 on the list. You gotta appreciate this really cool frog. It's gonna be fun to do jank brews around him. Next, number 8 on my list, which is probably the the Broken Green Mythic of the set. Everybody can make a joke about that, but still, this is a very powerful card. It's Cemetery Prowler. 1 and 3 green for a 3/4 wolf with Vigilance. That's very good. But also, when this enters the battlefield or attacks, you exile a card from a graveyard, so graveyard hate. Oh, and also, spells you cast got 1 less to cast for each card type that shows a card exiled with Cemetery Prowler. So, essentially, you're getting a 3-mana free 4 that is also graveyard hate, that can also, you can use as a combo piece because it can work as a semi-goblin electromancer to discount either your planeswalker spells, or your instant spells, sorcery spells, enchantment spells, and such. Being able to, granted, by the way this is worded, you're only going to get the 1 discount on it, but that can be... We have seen in the past where getting a 1-mana discount on spells is usually pretty good. Plus, also, just the fact that it's an attack trigger means we can constantly hate out very problematic cards in our opponent's graveyard, whether they're doing, like, Reanimator shenanigans, or if we're going against, like, let's say, the Blood on the Snow reanimation-based decks. Just being able to hate out the Planeswalkers, the Eye Twitches and such, is going to be very powerful. Keep an eye on the whole Cemetery cycle in general, especially the ones that have attack-based triggers when you can exile a card. These are usually very, very good. Keep an eye on these. But yeah, the one that made it to the list obviously had to be Cemetery Power because it's a wolf. You can put it in the Werewolf tribal deck. It also has graveyard hate. And it can also allow you to discount a lot of your very good spells within your deck design by just simply exiling them and just getting a 1-mana discount on could be a majority of your deck design, which could be very, very powerful. So don't underestimate that 1-mana discount, potentially. So Cemetery Power, very good card, and there's a reason why it is the number 8 on my list. Bada beep, bada boop.
7.
Number 7, and probably going to be one of my more controversial inclusions on the list, it's Odric the Blood Curse. 1 in Boros for a legendary creature vampire soldier. It's a free. When this enters the battlefield, you create X blood tokens, where X is the number of abilities from a mon: Flying, First Strike, Double Strike, Death Touch, Haste, Hexproof, Indestructible, Lifelink, Menace, Reach, Trample, and Vigilance, found among creatures you control. Okay, so yeah, let's get this out of the way. If you play this by itself, it is just essentially a free mana free. And that's a little bit of a wah, 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 wah. But I do think this is one of those cards that's actually going to be a lot more powerful than people take at first glance. Mostly because this is kind of one of those cards you're either going to kind of try either in Vampire Tribal or in kind of aggro-based decks if you are valuing blood tokens. Which, since this is the first time we're talking about blood tokens, let me elaborate while the editor puts a blood token on screen. Blood tokens are essentially artifacts that are a mechanic within the set that allows you to essentially spend 1 mana to sacrifice it and then discard a card in your hand to draw a card. Personally, I think the blood mechanic is actually a very powerful mechanic. I think it can help reanimate shells as well as just, in general, just being able to give any of your cards what basically amounts to cycling 1. That is a very powerful effect. Could be powerful in control-based decks, but can also be powerful in, like, aggro-based decks, personally, because it allows you to, once you inevitably get to the drawing lands, which you don't want to, you want to draw more aggro, put more aggro on the battlefield, you can just discard that land with a blood token and then hopefully draw into more gas. And I think Odric the Blood Curse is going to be kind of nifty in that sense, because majority of aggressive creatures in the format, at the current moment, both the 1-drops and 2-drops, they do have keyword abilities on this that Odric is going to check. So, at the very least, if you can get, at the very least, 1 or 2 blood tokens on this, I think you're good. But, of course, you can go Magical Christmas Land and actually make a very silly EDH deck where you get all the keyword abilities and make a lot of tokens. I think that's going to be one of those kind of really janky Christmas Land brews, but it's definitely possible. It's definitely something I might try inevitably on the Brewing Labs one way or another. But I still think in general this is just good for aggro decks in general for the fact that it gets you a resource which is the quote-unquote blood tokens to help you essentially fuel your later game aggro if you are getting kind of like land fueled. Like if you get too many lands drawn into your hand, essentially. But then on the other side of the coin, there is also the fact that I think this is also going to be good in vampire-based decks because I don't know if you noticed this, but vampires have a lot of keywords. Like, we have, like, the Valentine from Strixhaven, which is going to be a vampire that people are going to consider, and that has, like, 2 keyword abilities on it. A lot of vampires in Standard have a lot of keyword abilities. So I think Odric will, in general, in those vampire decks, produce a lot more blood tokens than people will take at first glance. Like, you definitely have to go, like, into a Mardu vampire list, or, if I'm being legitimately honest, you could just go into a Rakdos vampire list or Boros vampire list, and if you want to splash, like, a Rakdos card, or if you're in a Rakdos list and you want to splash the white for Odric, you can easily just play Voldarin at State, which, honestly, will help you fix for that white you need for Odric. And I feel like its mana generation for that, or not mana generation, that's a brain fart. Its potential generation of the blood tokens is actually a lot more powerful effect than people take at first glance. I'm even also considering this in Mardu reanimator based decks because mostly the most powerful creatures you want to reanimate does have keywords on it, and I feel like this is going to be a funny card to have in an Aghadeem's Awakening Chain, where essentially you, let's say, for example, Aghadeem's Awakening Chain for, let's say, 4 or 5. You have this as your free drop. You have a bunch of other creatures that have keyword abilities, and then essentially you generate, at least you get some mana value back with the blood tokens that you be used for late game draw. I think, and also for discarding potential powerful reanimated tools or reanimated creatures that you just want to reanimate later, or even flashback spells that you want to cast later. So yeah, I like Odric quite a lot. I think Odric is going to be a very potentially sleeper card for Standard. I think a lot of people are underrating the value of blood tokens, and yeah, Odric is going to cause some shenanigans. I think some more powerful shenanigans than people take at first glance. I think a lot of people are going to be surprised of how effective this might be in aggro just for the semi-card draw that you want to get from Odric, and getting still a board presence on board to boot.
Number 6.
Next up on the list is Olivia Crimson Bride, the Lady of Honor for this set expansion. 6 mana for a free 4 flying haste, and then whenever this attacks, you return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped and attacking. It gains whenever you don't control a legendary vampire, exile this creature. This is going to be a very powerful 1 or 2 of card in reanimated based deck designs, and even in Vampire Tribal potentially. I think this is a very powerful card just because it can do a lot of... It can bring back anything from your graveyard. It doesn't have like a weird clause of like, oh, you gotta return like a 3-drop, 2-drop, yada yada yada. No, you can return anything. And Standard does have enough really big game threats that being able to return it with Olivia attacking can be very, very, very powerful. So Olivia, very good for Martyr Reanimator. One other note I want to mention about this, CEDH players are actually talking about this card a lot, mostly because there's a good infinite combo you can do with Port Razor, along with a Sacrificial Outlet, where the basic premise is you get your extra combat steps with Port Razor once you attack each of your opponent, but then you can sacrifice it and then get the one more additional combat step with Olivia, and then return back Port Razor. It's considered a new instant, so you inevitably get like infinite combat steps. It's a very silly combo. I have to admit, when I first heard it, I was kind of surprised, but yeah, makes sense. Very powerful card in CDH, potentially. There's definitely some EDH players that are going to brew around this card, but I think this is also going to be a fun standard card. It is nice that they did the pre-order bonus, where you get one of these, essentially, if you do the pre-order bonus. Because I think in deck designs, you only need like 1 or 2 of this, but even as a 1 or 2 of, Olivia still is a very powerful card in the right deck. So, Olivia, that's the reason why it is number 6 on my list.
Number 5.
Next up on the list is Sorin the Murphress, 4 mana for a 4 loyalty planeswalker. Look at the top card of your library. You may reveal that card, put it into your hand. If you do, you lose life equal to its mana value. When at -2, you make a 2/3 black vampire creature token with flying and lifelink. And it also has a -7, where Sorin the Murphress deals 13 damage to any target, you gain 13 life. Overall, I kinda came around to Sorin being a lot more better than I thought initially. When I first saw this card, I wasn't as hyped as a lot of people were. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that Sorin is just overall a pretty good card. Being able to get the semi-card draw from it is very nice, or just being able to look at the top of your library. That's been proven time and again to be a very good effect. Not like an overpowerful effect, but a very good effect. Being able to make the token is very nice, can even synergize with token-based matter synergies. And also making a vampire can synergize with other cards in the set, like Anji, where you get the vampire, then you can get a blood token with Anji's that ETB effect when a vampire enters the battlefield. There's like synergies like that you have to keep in considering with the fact of the blood token, not the blood token, but the vampire token that you get from Sorin the Murphless. It's a very powerful card. Like, it's not like a busted card, but I do think it is actually a lot more fun to actually play around than I initially perceived. So, overall, Sorin the Murphless, it's pretty much number 5 on my list, because overall, I think it's a good card, and also, I do kind of want to do it in a sense of putting Sorin over Olivia, mostly just as a kind of semi-joke, in a sense, you know, because maybe Olivia would have been mad at it, yada yada yada, you know what I mean. Anyway, for those who read the lore and such. Anyway, number 5 on the list, Sorin the Murphless.
Number 4.
Next on the list is actually another card from this Cemetery cycle we've been seeing, and it's actually the Cemetery Gatekeeper. I think this is a very powerful vampire for the Vampire Tribal decks, because I think a majority of the Vampire decks are going to be either mid-range or aggro, and this is a very good aggro graveyard hate, essentially just being able to hate out specific cards from your opponent, and whenever they play those specific cards, they get dealt burn damage. Granted, you have to be cautious, you get dealt burn damage as well, but for some aggro decks, they're not going to mind the minimal points of damage with how much points of damage they're going to get to the opponent's face. Very good for aggro-based decks. I've even seen some modern players considering to put this in Modern Burn. It's a very good card. The Cemetery Gatekeeper gets the number 4 on my list just because it's going to be a very effective card in the modern format, but also it's going to be fun to play in Vampire, Tribal, and Standard.
Number 3.
Next up, probably one of the more weirder inclusions on the list, but I do think this is a really good card and people take at first glance. My number 3 on the list is actually Voldaren Epicure. This one's a little weird. It is weird to have a comment on a list on this, because you usually like to look at the flashy mythics, the flashy rares, all that stuff. But I do feel like this is actually a very powerful one-drop in Standard. I do think like for this is going to be an auto-include in Vampire Tribal-based decks, mostly because it does the ping to the opponent's face, which is actually going to be powerful with all the vampires we got from Midnight Hunt that have the synergies when you deal damage to your opponent. There's that aspect of it. There is also the aspect that you get the blood token, which I think in aggro decks, blood tokens are going to be a lot more valuable. So, and vampires is kind of being looked like to be brewed around as being a mid-range to aggro-based deck design. So being able to actually get the blood token to help you later down the line draw or use for other blood token synergies, that's very powerful. And it's also a very cheap creature that if you decide to incorporate cards like Agony's Awakening within your deck design, you can actually reanimate it as one of your one-drop vampires with Agony's Awakening. Would you like to have stuff like Valentine? In theory, yeah, but this is also another option if you want the synergies. I think just you get a lot of value out of this one drop with what the current vampire archetype is being brewed around. So I think this is going to be a very, very good one drop for the vampires list. So Voturan Epicure gets number 3 on my list because I think it's going to be the little hidden all-star for the deck in my personal opinion.
Number 2.
Number 2 on my list, and this one is going to be kind of a no-brainer for people who know that I like playing zombies. It's pretty much all the zombie support we got in this set. And, editor, you can probably put it all around. We got a lot of good zombies in this set. We got ways to give our zombies flying. We have ways to make zombie tokens when we exploit stuff. We have ways to double our zombies. We have ways to essentially make sure they protect our board of zombies by essentially if they die, they're going to make zombie tokens. Like, there's been a lot of zombie support that got printed in this set. Some that's going to be more for EDH, but I think there's going to be enough for it for Standard to actually make a very, very competitive zombie list. But if I had to restrict myself to one card for this, I think the one I'll go with is the one that I think even non-zombie decks are going to play as well as the zombie decks, which is Overcharge Amalgam. This is just a very, very powerful blue zombie, being able to have flash, being a free flyer, and just pretty much being a disallow on a body is very powerful in this standard environment. There's a lot of pretty much activated abilities that being able to counter with the Overcharge Amalgam can be very, very powerful. Eska Chariot's activations, or even Eska Chariot's ETB effects, Planeswalker activation abilities, etc., etc. Even activations of, like, manlands. Like, let's say your opponent decides to spend all their mana to make the Giant Storm, haul the Storm Giants, and then you can just essentially be like, okay, when you do that, I'm going to negate that ability, so you wasted your whole mana on this activated ability that you're not going to get. That's a very, very powerful ability. You can even use this to counter at level ups of classes. I think this is going to be a very versatile card in the meta. It's a very powerful zombie. But yeah, number 2 was just all the zombies. But if I had to pick one, it's going to be Overcharge Amalgam without a sweat.
Number 1.
And then number 1 on my list, and it's probably one of my personal favorite cards of the set, it is Kaya Geisshunter. Oh my, I love this card so much. The +1 on this is very powerful in like aggro-based deck designs. Being able to make all your creatures have Death Touch where they have essentially the ability to not be easily blocked, or if they are blocked, your opponent has to cost their creature to do it. That's very powerful. And then being able to put a +1 counter on a creature, on a token creature, is actually pretty more relevant than people will take at first glance, since we are going to have a lot of token generation in this meta. There's stuff like the Eska's Chariots of the Worlds. There's also stuff like, for example, maybe the zombie tokens. There's even little stuff here and there. Like, you can see a lot of creature tokens that are generated in this meta, and just being able to put a +1 counter on it is actually pretty nice. The -3 is also really good. It's ultimate. Oh, not it's -3, but we're actually going to talk about that a lot. But it's ultimate. It's -6. It's also really, really good. Being able to graveyard hate and generate potentially a ton of spirit tokens, that's very powerful. But if there's one reason why Kaya Geisshunter gets the number 1 on my list, it's probably its second minus. Well, not second minus, it's first minus, technically. It's -3, where you essentially get an Anointed Procession until in a turn. That's a very powerful ability to put on a Planeswalker activated ability. That is very powerful. I think a lot of people are underrating the factor that this could do some silly combo-based shenanigans. You can definitely play this minus a little bit fairy and just like double your token amounts, like double your creature tokens. But even then, that could be silly with cards like Mascot Exhibition and even Starnheim Unleashed in the meta. Like making double mascots, making double angels, that's a little bit silly. Even with saga bases that make tokens, making double of those can be really silly. But also the other thing I think people are underrating with Kaya is the potential with treasure generation. I feel like there's going to be some... I think a lot of treasure decks are actually going to like Kaya a lot, since doubling their treasure amount is going to be really, really silly. It pretty much makes all treasure generation spells can cost 3 or even get a mana rebate of potentially 1 or 2 mana, especially if you do combos with, like, Deadly Dispute with Champlain guys, Unexpected Windfall. There's a lot of treasure generation in this meta, and just being able to double the treasure amount can enable some silly ramp, or even potentially some silly combo decks, so that is why Kaya is personally my favorite card on the list. And that is my top 10 personal favorite cards from Crimson Vow. What are your personal favorites? If you like any, just post them out in the comments below. Nevertheless, sorry if my voice was not in the best condition for this. I think I had to recover from the extra live stream a little bit, but I still wanted to get this video out to my editor to edit, as well as just get this out for people who are considering to look at cards to play in Crimson Vow. Though I will offer my usual warning, and editor, if you want to, you could probably cut this little part and say, maybe cut the part what I'm about to say here and put it at the beginning if you want to, but that's your choice. But yeah, the one warning I will always say about when crafting cards, usually just play with the cards you pulled for the first few weeks and save your wild cards, and then later down the line, essentially once you see how the meta stabilizes, then you can kind of like craft into a deck and then save on wild cards and not waste your wild cards on a card that might not be as effective on grinding on ladder as you would expect. Nevertheless, thanks everybody who enjoyed the festivities of this top 10 list. Now, if you excuse me, I'm going to rest my voice a little bit more until we get to the more Crimson Vow shenanigans when the set comes out on Thursday. So, I hope you all have a lovely day. As they say, hip hip hooray. Bada beep, bada boop.